Hi, I'm Russ Long. This DVD is designed to be a tool to help you learn more about tracking, overdubbing, and mixing in your own studio. I've recorded 2 songs beginning to end, documenting everything from mic selection to mic positioning, preamp, EQ, compression settings, all the way through to the final mix. To observe 2 completely different recording scenarios, I recorded the first song, Mariana, with the very best mics, preamps, and equipment available. The second song, Lost in the Radio, was recorded with Shure SM57s and a Mackie 1604 mixer. My intention is to give you a taste of recording with the very best and most expensive gear, as well as that which is available to pretty much anyone. I've been in the recording business for 20 years, and I've had the privilege of working on hundreds of fantastic projects. One thing I can tell you is I still love the business, and I never get tired of learning. This DVD is designed to be a reference manual for you to refer to over and over again to help you consistently record fantastic sounds every time you're in the studio. That was Mariana. Now that you've heard the song, we're going to show you how we got there. I'm putting a AKG D112 on the kick drum, which is probably the most standard studio kick drum mic. I don't have one set mic I always use on the kick. I pretty much switch between the D112, the M88, or the RE20. And I've been using this new Audio-Technica 2500 some lately. That's a great idea. It has 2 capsules in one mic. It's a dynamic and a condenser capsule that are time-aligned in one microphone. The D112 is kind of my cover-all-bases mic. I usually put the kick drum mic a little bit, just a couple of inches inside the head. I don't want it to be too focused on just the front head. I want to make sure I'm hearing the full drum. So I put it all the way in. I don't put it right in the center because there seems to be some weird sound waves that happen right in the middle. So I'll offset it a little bit and then usually aim it back at the beater. Every kick drum varies, and a lot of times I'll mess around with a lot of different placement before I find what works best. I always use SM57 on the snare drum. And the placement varies from time to time. Sometimes I go more over the top of the drum, and sometimes I go back a little more pointing at the rim, depending on the song and how much crack I want or how fat it needs to sound. The mic gets too boomy and splatty if you point down too much at the head, so I try to stay away from doing that. Usually coming in at the angle gives you more of the sound from the center of the drum, and also keeps the low end frequencies from being too dominant. The mic I use on the bottom varies. Sometimes I use a 57, or sometimes I use a small diaphragm condenser like a 451, and sometimes I use a 414, but in this case I'm just going to start with a 57, and I do point that one straight at the head. I'm usually off about 2 inches or 3 inches. The next thing is the hi-hat, and for that I use the KM86i Neumann microphone, and it is a multi-pattern microphone. It has the same diaphragm as the KM84, but with selectable pickup patterns, and I will always put it on a figure 8. That's a trick I learned several years back. When you're doing a cardioid pattern, it's fairly wide, and a lot of times you'll end up picking up, depending on where they have their toms set up or their cymbals, you'll pick up a lot of that. But if you go to a figure 8, it narrows from the side, and then it just picks up on the top and bottom. So as long as you make sure there's not a cymbal directly on top, you can go to the figure 8 pattern, and you can cancel out a lot of what's coming in from the sides. And I usually put it about 3 inches off the hi-hat and facing directly down at the hi-hat. The KM84 is also a great mic to use for this. 451 works really well. MyLab 96B works well, or even a 414 or or 4033. There's a lot of options for hi-hat. I'm going to use Sennheiser 421s on both of the toms. That's a pretty standard tom mic. One mistake people make a lot of times is getting the mic too close to the drum. You want to make sure that the sound has time to develop. So I usually go about that far off the head, and then 2 or 3 inches off. I guess it's probably about 2.5 inches off the head, and point the mic a little more towards the center of the drum, and that seems to give the best sound. Another thing is the high-pass filter on the microphone. It can get turned real easy because it's a knob here, and I always check to make sure it's turned all the way to the left, which means it's off, because you don't want all the low end getting cut out of your toms. And I've in the past, well, several times I've encountered an assistant or somebody putting the mic up, and I go out and check it, and it's clicked up 1 or 2 notches. And so I've got in the habit of, when I check the microphones, I always make sure the high-pass filter is turned off. The floor toms seem to be the most picky of the toms, and sometimes there'll be the 421 won't work, and I'll try an RE20 or an M88 on the floor tom, but almost always the 421 works fine. The overhead mic is going to pick up primarily the cymbals, although it will pick up a fair amount of drums as well. The SF12 has a Royer emblem on the bottom of it, and you can see it there. I face that down and usually center it directly over the, not over the snare, but lined up with the snare drum, and as far as left to right goes. I raise it about 6 feet in the air, or if the cymbals were higher, I'd raise it a little bit more, but that usually ends up being a good amount. And this forward and backward position, pretty much try to kind of make it a center between all the cymbals, and it usually does a good job of capturing everything. Occasionally, if a person plays the ride cymbal fairly soft, I might put an additional mic on the ride cymbal, but usually the SF12 covers everything. For people who don't have a Royer, another common mic for the overhead is Audio-Technica 4033, Neumann U87, an AKG C12, but any condenser microphone works well. Typically you would have 2 or 3 of them, and placing them over the cymbals, usually about 18 to 24 inches. And if I had 2, I would place one over here and one probably about there, and that would give a great overhead sound as well. Man, kick drum sounds great.
Okay.
We're ready to cut the drums. I'm going to show you the settings we ended up with for each microphone, and talk to you a little bit about it. For the kick drum and the snare drum, we're using the Gordon mic pre, which is a remote pre. The preamp is actually sitting in the studio with the drummer, and I have a remote control unit that sits on the console, and I use those 2 knobs to adjust the gain. The kick drum, after the Gordon pre, goes through the left side of the GML EQ. I've got a shelf at about 40 hertz that I'm cutting
minus 3 dB, and that's pretty much to keep any really low rumbly frequencies out of the track. I ended up boosting a little bit of low end, 3 dB of 100 hertz. I'm rolling out quite a bit of low mids. Looks like between 9 and 10 dB at about 350 hertz. I've got a boost of 3 dB at about 3.5K, and I've got a boost of 9 dB at 10K. So overall it's pretty basic, except there's a big cut in the mids and a big boost on the top end. But that top end boost is what gives us that click on the attack, and pulling the low mids out makes the sound a lot more punchy. On the after the EQ, we're going through the TubeTech compressor, which just gives us a little bit of gain control. It's only compressing between 0.5 and 1 dB, so it's nothing drastic. And the output of the TubeTech allows me to do an adjustment of level to tape. And the attack is set on fast, as fast as it'll go, and then a fairly fast release as well. The snare drum also goes through the Gordon mic pre, and then goes through the GML. I've got a 9 dB cut at about 45 hertz. It's a shelf as well, so that's not really affecting the sound a lot. It's just keeping any low end rumble out of the signal path. There's a bit of a boost at about 175 hertz. Looks like about a 1.5 dB boost, just beefing up the bottom end a little bit. There's a 3 dB cut at 1K. I'm not sure why it is, but I seem to cut around 1K quite a bit on the snare. There's a boost of about 0.5 dB at 5K to brighten it up a little bit, and then there's a larger boost of 6 dB at 10K to add some air on top. After the GML EQ, the snare drum signal goes through the DBX 903 compressor, which sounds great on snare. I don't squash it too much. Probably when he hits extremely hard, it maybe compresses 2 dB, so it's nothing drastic. The hi-hat is going through the Focusrite ISA 220, and that's not what I always use for hi-hat. It varies from time to time, but the EQ on this box is really nice and gives you the ability to really scoop in and make adjustments. I've got a high-pass filter at a 300 hertz to get rid of all the low end, and then there's just a couple of minor. I'm cutting some at around 200 hertz, which is pulling out more low end. I'm boosting some at around 9K to add a little more sizzle on top, and boosting with a shelf at 15K, which adds a little more air on the top end as well. The first staking is on the bottom snare drum mic. I'm adding some 12K, which is just creating a nice air on the top end. I'm adding just a little bit of 7K. I'm pulling out some 1K, and I've got a 100 hertz high-pass filter, which keeps all the low end from overloading the channel. The first tom is going through this staking. There is a boost at 5K, which adds some top end attack. I'm pulling out some 500 hertz, and I've got a high-pass filter at 25 hertz. The floor tom is going through this staking. I've got a boost at 15K, which is just adding a little bit of air on the top end. I've got a boost at 5K, adding some attack on the drum. I'm pulling out a fair amount at 500 hertz, and I'm boosting a fair amount at 100 hertz, and there is no high pass or low pass filter. The Royer SF12 microphone, which is being used for the drum overhead, goes through the Longevin dual vocal combo. Both sides are adjusted identically. I've got a slight cut at 80 hertz, a boost at 12K, and then the same on the right side, a cut at 80 hertz and a boost at 12K. And the compressor is active, and it's being very with very minimal compression, never more than 1 dB. I'm running the bass through the Pendulum Quartet, which is an all-tube signal path. It's a tube mic pre with a tube EQ, and the EQ I'm just rolling off a touch of mids, and that's it. And then it's got a compressor for a little more gain control to into the computer, and you can see it's not compressing very much, maybe just 1 dB, and then straight out of this into the computer, and it sounds great.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4.
I've got a Royer R122, which is my favorite mic for electric guitars, and we're going to start off by putting just this single mic on the Vox cabinet, which is loaded with two 12-inch speakers. I like to put the 122 about halfway between the center of the cone and the rim, and to see exactly where that is, I'll use a flashlight to shine through the grill and see right where it is. That will help me accurately place the microphone. And I like to place it straight on about 3 inches away from the grill. There's a misconception that the more mics you put on a cabinet, the better it sounds. A lot of times when people don't have a guitar sound they're happy with, they think the answer is, let's put more mics on it. When more often than not, it's just a matter of using the right mic or putting it in the right position. And making sure the cabinet's in a good sounding room. You can't expect a bedroom to sound as good as a treated studio. But I found with the Royer 122 that about that much distance from the grill will still let you hear enough of the room to create a really great sounding guitar. In conjunction with the Royer R122 microphone, we're using the Gordon mic pre, the Chandler EQ, and the TubeTech CL1B compressor. The Gordon mic pre is providing 10 dB of gain. Then we're going into the Chandler LTD1, which is, we're going into the line input, not the mic input. We've got a high-pass filter set at 80 Hertz, a 2 dB cut at 390 Hertz, and that's all the EQ. And then we're going into the TubeTech CL1B for compression. I've got a ratio of approximately 3:1 with a fairly quick attack time, a very fast release time, and then I've got about a 1 or 2 dB makeup gain set to compensate for the compression. And that's all I'm doing. We're straight out of that into the Pro Tools rig.
Hi, my name is Chris. I'm here to do some keyboard overdubs. I actually just finished some keyboard overdubs. And I just want to tell you for a little bit about the gear that I'm using and how we've got it hooked up. In order to get keyboard sounds, I'm actually not getting sounds out of a keyboard itself. I'm getting the sounds out of the computer, and I'm only using the keyboard to trigger those sounds. In order to do that, I'm sending MIDI signal to the computer through a MIDI interface. In this case, we're just using a standard USB interface. To get the sound out, though, we need some kind of audio interface. We're using eMagic's EMI 2x6. We're going digitally, so the sound is actually never entering the analog realm. It's being generated by a computer digitally, being sent digitally through the interface and directly into Pro Tools. And to recap it, try and keep it as simple as possible. MIDI out of the keyboard, through a MIDI interface into the computer, audio out of the computer, again through a USB cable, through an audio interface out to a Pro Tools system.
Every digital device has its own internal clock, and it's extremely important when dealing with digital transfers that every unit involved is referencing the same clock. So in this case, I have a Lucid clock that my Pro Tools rig is looking at, and we wanted to make Chris's computer, his Logic system look at that same clock. So we ran an SPDIF cable out of the Pro Tools rig and into his EMI 2.6 box, and
in his software, he selected an external sync and switched it to SPDIF, and that allows his clock to be locked to my master clock. That way, when the digital transfer's being done, there's not any random clicking or popping.
Take you through a couple of the sounds that we're using in the song. In this case, I'm using an EVP 88 to get a couple of different road sounds. And you've got sound lists, you can walk through them, change it up to a Wurlitzer if you want. I have different plugins set to different tracks. All I have to do is select the different track and I've got the vibes. Or select a different plugin that has the organ set up.
The acoustic guitar on Mariana, we're going to use the AKG C28B, which is a peanut tube microphone from the 60s. It's my favorite acoustic guitar mic, and you may not be familiar with it by name, but I'm sure everybody's seen it. It's the microphone that was used on the Beatles' vocals on their famous San Francisco rooftop concert. And in that case, it was used with an extension capsule instead of the standard capsule. I like to place it between the 12th and the 15th fret. For the acoustic guitar on Mariana, in addition to the C28 microphone, we use the Daking mic pre and EQ and the TubeTech CL1B compressor.
We have a slight boost at 12K, cut at 500 hertz, and a slight boost at 100 hertz, and a high-pass filter at 50 hertz. The TubeTech is set to about a 2.5 or 3-to-1 ratio. A fairly quick attack time, a very quick release time, and a fair amount of makeup gain to compensate for the compression.
What do you do all day in that cold, dark room?
This is the Bronner VM1 KHE, which is my favorite vocal mic. It's a tube mic, and it's a mic that is currently in production, and it just sounds fantastic. It has all the nuances of a vintage tube mic, yet none of the noise. It's extremely quiet, and it still has a pristine top end, unlike any vintage mic I've ever heard. So it kind of combines the best of both worlds. One thing I like to do is place the pop filter, I guess about 3 or 4 inches back off the front of the mic, and then I'll have the singer sing about 2 or 3 inches behind the pop filter. And I'll usually put the mic a little bit above the singer's mouth and then angle it down just a hair, and that little bit of angle helps eliminate the pops or noises associated with the air hitting the microphone. And that, combined with the pop filter, creates a great vocal sound. For Mariana, we ran the Bronner mic through the Gordon mic pre with between 10 and 20 dB of gain depending on the part, and out of the Gordon mic pre into the Focusrite ISA 220. With the Focusrite, I had a high pass filter set around 75 hertz, and then I had a boost of a 2-3 dB at 15K, and I had a slight amount of compression at 4-to-1 ratio to smooth it out, and that's basically it, and that gave us our vocal sound.
I've been calling up for days, but I can't get through.
Before we get going, I want to talk a little bit about the setup we have for monitoring and everything in the control room. We have two pairs of monitors, a pair of PMC monitors, PMC TB1s, and a pair of Yamaha NS10s. The TB1s are powered by a Hafler Transnova P7000 amplifier, and the NS10s are powered by a Hafler Transnova P3000 amplifier. I don't use the NS10s very much. They're more for occasional reference, but the majority of the time I listen through the PMCs. A couple more broad issues to remember are, if you're mixing in a room that you don't typically work in, it's very important that you get acquainted to the sound of that room. So don't rush into a mix. Take some time to listen to a CD or two that you're very familiar with and get to learn the room. Make sure the bottom end sounds the same in the room as you know those CDs sound. And if it's lacking somewhere, or if there's too much of something, make mental note of that, because however your CDs that you know so well translate, your mix is going to translate in the same way. So this can really help out when you're considering overall EQ issues. The vocal on this song, we had the opportunity to use, of course, a way better microphone, way better preamp, way better compressor. So in the mix stage, I found myself using no EQ and just using a slight amount of compression with the McDSP compressor again, starting with the British Comp 1 mode and then tweaking it a little bit for the song. A lot of times if I'm having problems with sibilance, I'll use a de-esser, and if I can't get the right reaction out of a de-esser, I'll go in and physically turn down the volume on the actual S sounds. That's something I did on this line. Here's what the line sounded like before I adjusted it.
Look in my eyes, I wanna see that smile.
There's three S's, and the second one is the one that tends to be the biggest problem. If I turn my automation on, you'll hear a difference.
Look in my eyes, I wanna see that smile.
I've physically turned down each of those S's. You can zoom in and see that the S has been actually turned.
I wanna see that smile.
Has been turned down from -2.8 to -7, so it's actually 4.2 dB quieter than the rest of the line. That's a little bit time consuming, but I have really good results with it, and a lot of times I'll spend a couple of hours on a song going through and writing certain consonants that are too loud or too soft, and in addition to doing the regular vocal rides to make the vocals sit just right in the track. I typically EQ background vocals a little bit thinner and smaller sounding than the lead vocal. Of course, there's no rules. On the case of Mariana, I have a high-pass filter on the background vocals at 155 hertz and cut at 340 hertz, 1.6 dB to kind of clean up the low mids, and then I've got a boost at 10.5K of 2 dB, and I believe I have the same EQ on all 5 of the backing vocal tracks. That's right, and the backing vocals all have a effect on them as well, a reverb. Let me play the backing vocals without the effect.
Remember the blue sky, who you are.
That's what they sound like without the effect.
Remember the blue sky, who you are.
And that's what they sound like with the effect. There's even more of that effect in the bridge on the third backing vocal track. This is what it sounds like without effect.
What What's so terrible? What's so bad?
And here's what it sounds like with the reverb.
What's so terrible? What's so bad?
Here's what it sounds like along with the lead vocal.
Now what's so terrible? Oh, what's so bad?
I EQ'd the drums a lot less on this song than I did on the other song, primarily because we had better microphones and better preamps and better EQs as we tracked them. And looking back, the kick drum has no EQ at all. The snare drum has a little bit of EQ, a high-pass filter at 90 hertz, and a boost at 4K, 2.5 dB. The bottom snare drum mic has no EQ. The hi-hat has a high-pass filter at 124 hertz. There's a boost of 1.7 dB at 9.4K. There's no EQ on the toms. And the overheads have a high-pass filter at 118 hertz and a 2 dB boost at 10.5K. I typically stay away from drum compression in the mix if I compressed on the front end, which we did in this case. We compressed the kick drum and the snare drum as we were tracking. The one exception to this is room mics. I'll usually squash them to death, but besides that, I stay away from a whole lot of compression. There is also a deverb being used on the drums. It's the Room 2 set to a medium size with a 711 millisecond decay time. Something else we should talk about is the correlation between the top snare drum mic and the bottom snare drum mic. A lot of times I don't even use a bottom snare drum mic. It just depends on the sound we're going after or how the drum set sounds. But when I do, I usually don't add very much of it in. We can look on this song. I've got the snare drum set at -4, but the bottom mic is set at -16.5. So the actual top mic is over twice the volume of the bottom mic, and that's pretty typical of where they would blend it in one of my mixes. Mariana also has a drum loop, and I found once I started mixing and combining it with the drums that the top end of the loop was a little too piercing and cutting, so I ended up pulling out 4 dB of 3.4K to smooth it out and warm it up a little bit. And I also set the high-pass filter at 90 hertz to pull out some of the lower end in the loop. There's a kick drum in the loop that was fighting the real kick a little bit, so pulling the lower frequency out tended to solve that problem. During the break before the third chorus, I actually raised the volume of the loop because the drum set dropped out at that point. But I found that the bottom end in the loop even got in the way more, even with the high-pass filter in effect. So at that point, I automated the high-pass filter to an even higher frequency. So instead of dropping everything off below 90 hertz, it drops everything off below 300 hertz. This is what the transition sounds like going into the break before the third chorus. And along with the drums, it sounds like this. The bass guitar in Mariana required a little bit of EQ. I ended up boosting 78 hertz, 1 dB, to add a little more bottom end. And to make sure the bottom didn't get too cluttered, I have a high-pass filter at 28 hertz. I also boosted 1.4 dB at 2.1K. This adds a little more definition to the bass and let it pop out of the mix a little bit more. There's also some compression on the bass guitar. Nothing too drastic, but just a slight compression to smooth out the overall sound. We ended up not using any compression or EQ on the 12-string guitar. Chris played it very smoothly, and the amp's tone was perfect, so it fit into the mix just right without any compression or EQ. On the chorus guitar, we had a slight bit of EQ. We pulled out the bottom end with the high-pass filter, set it at 100 hertz, and I had a 1.7 dB boost at 4K. This added a little shimmer on the top of the guitar, and that was enough to make it fit into the mix perfectly. On the outro guitar, we had a similar EQ setting, 118 hertz high-pass filter, cutting out everything below 118 hertz. I pulled out 1.5 dB at 340 hertz. This opened up the guitar a little bit, letting it sit into the mix without muddying up the mix. And to add a little shimmer on the guitar, I boosted 5K, 1.4 dB. And this was a shelf, so it boosted everything above 5K. Interesting enough, I didn't use any compression on the electric guitars. I typically compress electric guitars when I mix, but for some reason these guitars just set perfectly in the track without any compression at all. As far as acoustic guitar goes, we didn't use any EQ, just a subtle compression to allow the instrument to sit into the track. I didn't use any EQ or compression on the keyboards of Mariana, which brings up an interesting point. Keyboard players often ask me what they can do to make their sounds and parts more mix ready. More often than not, their money could be best spent on a great pair of monitors and a little room treatment so they can hear what's going on. On the stereo bus, we have a couple of pieces of analog gear, a high-pass filter, and the L2 limiter. It's the exact same processing we'll be using on Lost in the Radio, so we'll discuss it in more detail soon. Now that we've recorded with the expensive stuff, we're going to do a song with Shure SM57s and a Mackie 1604 mixer.
Sublime. Up here on a stage, I can show you all of my affection. I've got nothing more than fantasy in mind. We could dance, have a go, make it fast, make it slow, throw a party for the people that you know. Turn it up, turn it down, watch the world spin around. Everybody, let's get lost in the radio.
Our approach for miking the drums on this song was to get us set up using cheap mics that would be available anywhere and that pretty much everybody has anyway, which is the Shure SM57. We also took that same approach in the control room with mic pre's. Instead of using individual microphone preamplifiers, we've used a Mackie 16-channel mixer and used the preamps and EQ in that, and that's the case with every input here except for the kick drum. The Mackie only has 6 inputs, so the snare, the hi-hat, the 2 toms, and the 2 overheads are all running through the Mackie. And then we ran the kick drum, which is also an SM57, through the Focusrite 220 mic pre and EQ. For the placement in the kick drum, we've set the 57 off center and then pointed it back towards the beater. But it's far enough back in the drum to where it's actually hearing the sound of the drum and not just the sound of the beater head. For the snare drum, we're coming in at an angle, pointing more towards the center of the head, but coming across the head. We want to make the snare drum sound as good as possible, but we also want to make sure we're not getting a lot of hi-hat or crash cymbal in the snare drum mic. So this will both do a good job of rejecting those unwanted sounds and picking up the snare drum. I always tell people, you don't think of this as just the snare drum mic. You think of every one of these mics as a drum kit mic, but with a certain emphasis. This is a drum kit mic with an emphasis of the snare drum. This is a drum kit mic with the emphasis of a tom. Don't be afraid if you're hearing other sounds through those mics. You're going to hear bleed because the drum set's one instrument. I've placed the mic about 2 inches above the hi-hat, making sure that I'm not parallel with the hi-hat so I don't get too many
low rumble frequencies, but I give it a bit of an angle, which creates a nice sound. For the toms, we've come in about an inch or so from the rim, and then again pointed the mic towards the center of the drum, but not with quite the same angle as with the snare drum. There's a little more downward angle on both of the toms, and this gives a little more bottom and a little fuller sound. For this recording, to show that you can do a complete drum set with 57s, I've put 2 overhead, and I want to analyze each situation differently, but he's using 3 cymbals, so I've placed this one to where it'll cover the ride and the crash pretty evenly, and then this one will cover this crash, and it gets a little bit of the hi-hat too, so they're pretty equally distributed. And then I also listen as I'm getting sounds and try to make sure the snare drum is pretty balanced between the two, so if I raise or lower the volume of the overheads, it doesn't make the center of the snare drum drift to one side or the other. We use the Mackie 1604 for the drums on this song. It only has 6 microphone preamps in it, so for our 7th mic, which was the kick drum, we used the Focusrite ISA 220. If you plug a 1/4 inch jack just halfway in to the insert, you can use that as a direct out. So we would run the microphone into channel 1 and then out of the insert send, and that would be how we'd get our individual outs, so each one of these could go to a separate track. The biggest challenge of using 57s on the entire kit was the kick drum, and we decided to run it through the ISA 220, which has a great EQ, extremely flexible, and a great sounding mic pre. We have a high pass filter set at about 30 or 40 hertz, and we have low mids being rolled out about 300 hertz, being cut pretty drastically. I have a boost at just under 9K, probably 8.5K, and I have a low shelf boost at 56 hertz. To set levels using the Mackie, I would set the fader to unity gain and then use the preamp control to adjust the output. For the snare drum, I turned the preamp all the way down and I was still getting a little bit too much output gain, so I backed the fader off a bit. On the other 5 channels, I was able to leave the fader at unity and make all my adjustments at the preamp. We ran the snare drum through the first channel, and I boosted the high end a little bit. I rolled a little bit of the mid out, and I rolled a bit of the low end out. The hi-hat went through channel 2, where again I boosted the high end, I cut a little bit of the mids, and I rolled the low end all the way out. The first tom is going through channel 3, where I boosted the high end, I cut the mids, and the low end remained flat. The second tom went through channel 4, where I boosted the high end, I cut some mids, and I added some low end. And the overheads, which are